I want to speak of the parallels between the description of the creation of the cosmos in the Rig Veda and later texts such as the Puranas or even the Mahabharata or Yoga Vasishta and the theories that we have in modern cosmology. In particular, we have the Nasadiya Sukta and the Hiranyagarbha Sukta, which speak of the non-existence of time and space before the moment of creation. And people have written a lot of material on how this corresponds with modern theories related to Big Bang and all that. Now, it so happens that this is something that I worked on, especially in the last couple of years. I have published a whole series of papers on the ontology of space and consequently also with implications for ontology of time. And they have appeared in journals such as Nature's, Scientific Reports, and others. And the motivation or the beginning of this research for me has been the study that I did a few years ago of Kannada's Vaisheshik Sutras. And in fact, I did a translation as a book called Matter and Mind, where one finds a very impressive and modern scientific perspective on what the universe is or what reality is. And briefly what it says is that all the properties that we wish to relate to physical reality are a consequence of substance, their characteristics and their motions, dravya, guna, and karman. And so this is irrespective of individuals who are observing the system. And then as far as we observers are concerned, there is another triad, and this triad is samanya, which is universal, vishesha, which is particular depending upon how we interact with the reality, and the third is samavai, which is that interface between us or consciousness and the physical system. Now, what's impressive about this text, which very few Indian scientists read or physicists read, because I've been astonished at how little this text is known, even though it's one of the starting points of one of the great darshanas within India. The emphasis here is, of course, that the whole creation in our minds, and it's not inconsistent with other perspectives such as that of Vedanta, is a consequence of how we fit the impressions that come in through our senses into a framework. So in other words, what it really means is that the manner in which in the Western tradition, after Descartes and going on to Newton, and more recently, 100 years ago, say Einstein, where space is viewed as a kind of a container, a three-dimensional container, if you will, into which substances or objects are placed. And then in Einstein's modification, that this container has some bumps and curves and all that stuff. And of course, this can also be traced back to the perspective that the Greeks had. Now, the Vaisheshika perspective is somewhat different, that the very conception of space, that is ontology of space and time, and we see echoes of it in all texts, in the Mahabharata, in Yoga Vasishta, in the Puranas, in different ways, is a consequence of the working of the mind. And therefore, to take space as three-dimensional itself is problematic. Now, with this in mind, a couple of years ago, there's been well, a couple of years ago, there was a Scientific American article speaking of the great cosmological crisis of our times, where there are two different speeds associated with the expansion rate based on how we measure it. And these speeds arise out of whether we are looking at the background microwave radiation or whether we are looking at the candles, which is the stars, at different places, and therefore then determining how they may have expanded across the distance from each other in time. And what it leads to is to different speeds or rates of expansion, which in spite of the great efforts of different astronomers and cosmologists over the past 20, 30 years, has not been possible to bridge. And there is a difference of about 10% in these two figures. And I will not go into the exact figures. Now, my own research in this and also in logic had led me early last year to this theorem, which has been known in certain circles of logic, that two-dimensionality is not optimal. Three-dimensionality is, if you're looking at it in terms of integers. In fact, I'm talking of two-way logic versus three-way logic, and one could say that these logics are which congeal possibly into 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions. Now, I proved a theorem last year, a mathematical theorem, and later on I was able to approach it both from the classical perspective and quantum perspective. And I was able to show that the optimal is E-dimensional, which is slightly less than 3-dimensional, because E, as we know, the constant is 2.718 and so on. It's not a rational number. And I applied this to this problem of the expansion rate, and I was able to resolve it, because if the background microwave radiation is related to this optimal E-dimensionality, because everything in the physical universe is optimal, and therefore the actual ontology or structure of space should be E-dimensional. And while we, through our minds, impose a 3-dimensional structure which corresponds to the speeds that we compute when we look at the way the stars have been receding from each other, and this completely resolves this problem. So this was published last year, November, in Nature Scientific Reports, and I was able to extend it in many different directions subsequently. And therefore, what it tells us, and of course, this is just the beginning, because this means a major revision to our perception of space and time, which is at the basis of cosmology. Now, science is all a conversation. This is just a starting narrative, and we are yet to see how this will evolve or unfold. But one can step back and also note that cosmology as it exists right now is at the worst possible or worst imaginable crisis, because 99.5% of the cosmos cannot be explained away by our current theories. And that's why there's been the need to invoke dark energy and dark matter, for which there is not the slightest shred of evidence. And in my view, if one were to further go back to this whole question of Samavaya in Vaisheshika Sutras, possibly we may be able to make fundamental advance in our understanding of cosmology and resolve this huge problem that there is about dark matter and dark energy. Now, this is all my background to this whole question of trying to trying to see what we have in Nasadiya Sukta or Hiranyagarbha Sukta as paralleling Big Bang. And what I mean by that is that Big Bang itself is a relic of thinking about all this problem, which goes back 30, 40, 50, 60 years. And right now, the complications that we have in the field of scientific cosmology are very large, and perhaps therefore to compare Big Bang to what we have in Nasadiya Sukta or Hiranyagarbha Sukta is going down a path which may not be all that fruitful, because the devil is in the details. Just speaking of, this is the moment of creation, and this is something that there are many theories right now, multiverse, for example, where we are not talking about creation in this, there is not there being a single creation, or there could be conception of many different universes. So I think the need is to, rather than look at parallels between the conceptions that we have suggested in coded and subtle ways by the rishis, is to examine what we have in the Vedic text on its own terms and leave physics aside, because physics, as I mentioned, right now cannot explain 99.5% of the observed universe. And I think when one does that, but that's where a lot of effort is required. And sadly, since in the last 70 years, 3 or 4 generations of Indians have been totally alienated from their own scientific tradition. And this is, of course, an example of epistemicide that the British exercised over India after the 1820s or 30s, where we were separated from our own epistemological tradition. So I think what one needs is to look at not just these hints and suggestions, but further elaborations of it. Because, for example, we do know, and this you see in all the darshanas, not just Vaisheshika or Vedanta, even in yoga or tantra, there is this whole sequence or elaboration of evolution or involution, how the Mahabhutas are generated, and when you have pralay, and there are passages on it, for example, even in the Mahabharata, there is a involution. For example, it's very interesting. There are these parallels also, and maybe some scientists or physicists in India would want to explore this further. For example, this famous passage in the Mahabharata speaks of that before pralaya occurs, first of all, the sun becomes larger and larger, which is quite parallel to what we are told by modern cosmology, that the sun will become a red giant. So then all the Prithvi Tattva or Prithvi Mahabhuta will convert into Apaha, which in turn, so first of all the large materiality will disappear, and we'll only have fluid flow, which parallel to that is, say, electrons. And then all of this will in turn change into just tejas, which is light. And then all of this will change into vayu. And vayu, we don't know. Vayu, does it represent neutrinos? Because if you have parallels between the Mahabhutas and the stable conception of the universe in terms of these four different substances, stable substances, namely proton, electron, photon, and then neutrino. So, and then all of this gets involuted into akasha, and then it's absorbed into consciousness. So I think what is required, in my view, is to explore all this on its own terms in a scientific way, in a critical way, and that would be necessary in order to understand this material properly. Now, of course, there are those who ridicule all of this, saying that, hey, what's wrong with Indians? They are looking at texts which are 3,000 years ago, and how could they have foreseen anything related to the cosmos or consciousness? Well, the answer to that is very simple. Everything that we know resides in our consciousness. So consciousness truly is the deepest mystery there is. It's the fount. In fact, what I know or what you know is also, it resides within each one of our consciousness. And therefore, it's not inconceivable that by using consciousness to reflect on itself, that wonderful insights could have been arrived at. And certainly we do know that the Vedas themselves call themselves Atma-vidya, or the science of consciousness. So I think there are so many possibilities here, so such a lot of potential of also making an attempt to understand the cosmological aspects or descriptions or narratives in the Puranas themselves. I think as Manishis or as great scholars like Ananda Kumaraswamy said, or Aurobindo. Aurobindo was not an academic, but certainly Ananda Kumaraswamy was an academic, where he insisted that literally everything that we have or in the descriptions of India by Indologists and their followers is worthless. In his book Hinduism and Buddhism, and he was talking about Hinduism. So I think we need to come back to it, but use critical reasoning to see what these parallels mean, and trying to see those parallels will also make better sense of the descriptions that we have, and we'll be able to go beyond the broad brush parallels that we see, for example, in Nasadeya Sukta or Hiranyagarbha Sukta and Big Bang, and go into the details. I think that's where a lot of wonderful insight will come. Thank you very much.